Good afternoon, brothers and sisters in the Dharma. Sukihotu. I would like to thank, first of all, Klang and Coast Buddhist Association for inviting me to join in today for this live Dharma sharing. Today is actually the second in a series of 3 sharings. So let me just put up my PowerPoint and then we can get started with it. Okay, so hopefully the PowerPoint is clear. All right, so the topic today is the fourfold supernormal realities. This is actually the interpretation of the Pali phrase, Chattari Arya Sachani, which is normally translated as the Four Noble Truths. My teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji, translated this actually very precisely, that Chattari means four stages. Arya actually normally translated as noble, but Bhante Punaji pointed out it is actually beyond noble. It is even beyond normal. That's why he calls it supernormal. And of course, he translates the word Sachani to be realities, because we are actually looking at what the Buddha has gone through from his past life until he became the Sammasambuddha. So that was his realities, and he was teaching us these realities. The reason why Bhante Punaji did not use the word truth is because truth can be quite a misleading term, because when you talk about religion, religious truth means it's some truth they took from the heaven and delivered it to people, but that is not what happened in the case of the Buddha. It was what the Buddha had gone through from his past lives until he became the Sammasambuddha. So it was his experience, it was his realities. So he was teaching us his realities about this fourfold realities of dukkha. Okay. Now, before I go into any further details, I would like to share with you this link for those of you who are interested. You may use this link to download the presentation file, which is what you can use to follow my presentation today. So if you happen to use it on your camera, quickly take a snapshot and then go ahead and download that document. Otherwise, feel free to just join in. So fourfold supernormal realities, how did it all begin? It began when the Buddha, just before the Buddha became enlightened, he was Prince Siddhartha, and he found opportunities to leave the palace, to go out to the common areas and see for himself the realities of life. And he came across 4 great signs. Remember, in those days, just recall that Prince Siddhartha was living a life of luxury. He was protected so much that he was not normally allowed to go out to the open areas into the villages. But this time, he managed to go out from time to time, and he came across these 4 signs. The first one was an old man. And then he said to himself, well, if people can get old, I too can get old. And then he came across a sick man. And he realized that people do fall sick, and even he himself could fall sick. And then he came across a dead person. And of course, he also realized people do die. And when he came across an ascetic or a monk in those days, he then asked that ascetic, what were you doing? And then he realized that the ascetic was cultivating to find the way to be free from all this suffering. So he was seeking for freedom from all suffering. And then that was when Prince Siddhartha realized he had to do something. And finally, he decided to leave his family, leave his beautiful wife and newborn child, and leave the comfort and luxury of the palace, and went out and started practicing. And he came across 2 very good teachers. And from these 2 teachers, he learned a great deal. But he realized that these teachers were not themselves arahant, so he needed to go beyond. And therefore, he went and practiced on his own. And along the way, he met up with 5 ascetics, and they all practiced asceticism. What they were really trying to do, right, is exactly what every religion tries to do since the dawn of civilization. The greatest problem to be solved by humanity, by all religion, is the problem of existence. Birth, aging, sickness, and death. And that's what he was trying to solve, this problem, by finding freedom from all suffering, because suffering came originally from these birth, aging, sickness, and death. So to be free from all this, so he was looking for the solution. Finally, when he broke away from the 5 ascetics and went on his own, when he realized asceticism didn't work, he went under the Bodhi tree and meditated, and eventually became awakened as the Sama Sambuddha. So in that process of awakening, of course, he was greatly disturbed by Mara, and Mara sent his 3 daughters to disturb him. Mara is not some external being. It is actually our internal psychological demon within us. And when Mara sent the 3 daughters, it represented the 3 poisons. Lobha, which is lust and greed towards what is pleasant. Dosa, which is anger and hatred towards what is unpleasant. And moha, which is the delusion of a self-centered existence. These are called the 3 poisons, the akusala mula, the 3 poisonous roots, which are the roots of all our suffering. Moving on, when the Buddha became enlightened as the Sama Sambuddha, then we begin to learn a lot from him, and we begin to take refuge in the Buddha. I would like to show you this clip by my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji, where he explained what is the meaning of taking refuge in the Buddha. And I think it's very important, because this message is so important that I felt it is very necessary for us to listen to this before we even start examining the teachings of the Buddha, which we call the Dharma.
To take refuge in the Buddha is not to take refuge in power. To take refuge in the Buddha is to take refuge in the wisdom of the Buddha. We take refuge not in the powers of the Buddha. We take refuge in the wisdom of the Buddha. It is the wisdom of the Buddha that we call the Dhamma. Dhamma is the wisdom of the Buddha, not the power of the Buddha. All these other religions that worship the creator of the world or the gods, supernatural beings, they are seeking refuge in power. That doesn't help. Power is necessary to change nature, to control nature. But wisdom is necessary to control our mind. That is how the teaching of the Buddha differs from all other religions. Because all other religions are seeking power. It is only the teaching of the Buddha that takes refuge in the wisdom of the Buddha. That is why the Buddha is considered to be the wisest person in the world.
Taking refuge in the Buddha. You heard that Bhante Punaji was explaining. We take refuge not in the powers of the Buddha, we take refuge in the wisdom of the Buddha. And the wisdom of the Buddha is the Dharma. Other religions that worship the creator of the world, gods, supernatural beings, they are seeking refuge in power. Power is necessary to change nature, to change the environment, to control nature. If we try, but we often are not able to do that easily. We can't even stop the coronavirus pandemic. So power really in this world is quite useless. We can't even stop the pandemic arising, right? And wisdom is necessary to control our mind. We may not be able to change what's happening out there, but we can change what goes on inside us to control our mind, to tame our mind, to cultivate ourselves and develop our mind to become free from suffering. We may, until we become the Arahant, we can still cultivate our mind to be free from suffering on a time-to-time basis. Maybe not continuously, but once we become Arahant, then we would be totally and completely free from all suffering. Until then, we can still cultivate our mind, developing wisdom from the Buddha, and be able to free ourselves from suffering from time to time. And this suffering that the Buddha was talking about, that is called dukkha. I'm going to come to explanation further about the dukkha in a moment. And that is how teachings of the Buddha differs from all the other religions. The Buddha, therefore, is considered the wisest man in the world. What he has taught us is this wisdom that can free us from all suffering. And he started teaching this after he became enlightened. And he came across the 5 ascetics to explain to them what he had discovered. Because when he first became enlightened, he did not want to teach because he realized it was so difficult. He went through so much to become enlightened. So he thought that everybody has so much dust in their eyes, they would never understand his teaching. Then, of course, the Brahma, Mahabrahma, one of the Mahabrahma came down from the heavens and told to him, you must teach because there are people with only a little bit of dust in their eyes. First, he wanted to teach his first teacher. He wanted to go and look for his first teacher. Right? And then he was told that he had passed away 7 days ago. And then he realized, okay, I have a second teacher, Udaka Putra. So he wanted to look for his second teacher. Again, he was told his second teacher had just passed away the day before. Then he thought about who else would have little dust in their eyes. And he realized that he had these 5 ascetic friends. So he went out and in search of these 5 ascetic friends, and he found them, and they gathered together. At first, they were reluctant to regard him as anything more than just an ordinary being because they thought that he had abandoned asceticism. But as they got near him, they realized that he was a very special being. So together, the Buddha delivered that first sermon called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra, setting into motion the wheel of Dharma. And in that sutra, he explained for the first time about quite a lot of things. Firstly, he spoke about the medial way, and then he went on to explain the 4 noble truths. Right? So let's take a look at those 4 noble truths. The first, he says, that there is dukkha, that every one of us experiences dukkha. And there is samudaya, which is the origin of dukkha. What leads to dukkha? What causes dukkha? Then came the good news that all that can be brought to an end. Nirodha is the complete and remainderless cessation of all dukkha. And finally, he says there is the way leading to it, the magga, which is the eightfold way that can help us come out of dukkha, end all dukkha. The Buddha actually went through a very tedious, lengthy, and very deep process of becoming enlightened. This is why when he became enlightened, he wasn't just like an ordinary Arahant. He was a Sama Sambuddha, capable of teaching gods and men. So as Sama Sambuddha, he actually realized that the method he had gone through to become enlightened was too difficult for people to practice. And he very wisely came up with a simplified method called the Eightfold Way. So these are the Four Noble Truths. There is dukkha, there is an origin of dukkha, there is an end to dukkha, and there is the way leading to the ending of dukkha. Let's look at these Four Noble Truths one at a time. First, the first Noble Truth, there is dukkha. So there is he mentioned that there is the noble truth of suffering called dukkha, and he mentioned 8 conditions surrounding dukkha. First, the first 4, birth, aging, illness, and death. These are the first 4 conditions that are called dukkha. And then he went on to describe number 5, separation from what is pleasing is dukkha. This means that when we have experienced something that was pleasant, something we enjoyed, something that made us happy, and then we lost it, we no longer have it. That's why he said separation from what is pleasing. Pleasing can be a number of things. It can be objects and property, like for example, your cell phone. A lot of people get a lot of joy from using their cell phone. What happens if you lose your cell phone, right? So losing your cell phone is separation from a piece of property that you have. And that is great suffering. Who can tell me that if you lose your cell phone, you don't feel bad? Everybody who loses his cell phone experiences great suffering, dukkha. So separation from what is pleasing. Now, what is pleasing can also be other things, not necessarily just an object that you possess, but it also could be a relationship, your marriage. What happens if a person's marriage fails and he has to divorce? Or in some countries, Catholic countries, they cannot divorce. They have to annul the marriage, end of the marriage. So ending a relationship, that is dukkha. Whenever a relationship comes to an end, for whatever reason, it is dukkha. And then it can also refer to people that you know, people in your life. You may have an old elderly grandmother or grandfather or some elderly relative that you are very close with, that you have enjoyed their company. They have taught you a lot of things. What if they pass away? So you lose a dearly beloved person because that person now passes away. And that is dukkha, to lose a person. And then there are also other experiences, like for example, circumstances. You have a job, and during the coronavirus pandemic, some people lost their job. Losing their job is separation from what was pleasing, because the job provided them money to feed the family. The job provided them some level of esteem to tell people they are successful. Now, if you lose your job, that is suffering. So separation from what is pleasing can be any one of these 4. A piece of property that you have, a relationship that you have experienced, a person that is close to you in life, and also circumstances that have brought you peace, happiness, and enjoyment in life. It can also be pleasures, right? We enjoy, it's like some people, they love durian. So these are all pleasures. And when you are not able to enjoy these pleasures, that is suffering. What happens if somebody, the Ministry of Health comes and say, oh, because of the pandemic, they have spread to the animals, coronavirus has spread to bats, from bats to humans, now they spread to all other species of animals, and bats often pollinate these durian trees, and because of that, all the durian trees in the whole country have to be chopped down. We will not have durian trees for the next 20 years. Nobody can have durian for 20 years. Is that happiness or suffering? That is separation from what is pleasing. So these are all many things that happen in our life that can bring about dukkha, because we are separated from what used to be something we enjoyed. And this is also the same reason why the Buddha warned us, don't find happiness in sensual pleasures, because sensual pleasures are not permanent. They come, they go. And some can even turn into problems, and they will hurt us. So if you find happiness in sensual pleasures, eventually you will experience suffering, because because everything is coming and going. We can never have it forever. Then number 6, the Buddha said, union with what is displeasing is dukkha. That means something which hurts us, that harms us, that brings us discomfort, displeasure, unhappiness, disease. That is dukkha if we are stuck with it. And every single one of us is stuck with this big problem in the last 9 months. It is called coronavirus. We are all stuck with it. Coronavirus pandemic. We are stuck with it, and it is displeasing. Isn't it dukkha? Right? Of course, some people are very smart. They have found a way to live through this peacefully and happily. And I'm happy to say that I'm one of them. But basically, when we are stuck with something like that, it is very uncomfortable. It is very unpleasant. So that is all dukkha, right? Union with what is displeasing is dukkha. Number 7, the Buddha also said, not to get what one wants is dukkha, which means we have an aspiration, we have a goal, we have something we wish for, a desire, and we don't get it. We fail to get it. Something went wrong and we are not able to get it. That is dukkha. Some of us may have some business and we hope that the business will expand. But due to the difficult conditions we are going through now, with all the restrictions, the business collapsed and we no longer have that business. We have a wish for the business to expand, but now the business is scaled down, especially people who own restaurants. For a long time, they couldn't serve customers in the restaurant. They have to serve only takeaway. And even takeaway, that business is so small compared to dine-in, right? And takeaway is small business and it costs a lot of extra money. And going through all that difficulty, you don't get what you want. So not getting what you want, not getting what you wish for, you can't expand your business. All that is suffering. It can also be other things that you wish to, let's say a young couple wish to have children. And then they discovered maybe the wife or maybe the husband has some fertility problem, infertility, unable to bear children. Or the wife has a certain maybe illness or disease in the womb, and the doctor warned that lady cannot have children, or she will risk, dying, or risk having very severe illness. So not to get what wants, not able to have children, that is suffering. So these are the various conditions that are suffering. But of all these, it is number 8 that the Buddha pointed out. And it is this number 8, in brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging is suffering. It is this number 8, which is what I call the mother of all suffering. All these actually stem from number 8. The 5 aggregates subject to clinging. What does that mean? It comes from that Pali term, pancha upadana kanda. Pancha kanda refers to the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates is what the Buddha described as the process by which, when light enters the eye, we're able to see. When sound enters the ear, we're able to hear. When aroma enters the nose, we're able to smell. And when flavors come into contact with the tongue, we're able to taste. And when the body comes into contact with tangible objects, we're able to touch and feel objects. So these are 5 physical senses. And then they come together in the mind, and the 6th sense is the thinking and the imagination, the memory, all various aspects of mental objects arising. So those are all together the 6 different sensual fields. 5 physically, and number 6 is the mind. I spoke a little bit about this in the previous sharing. Right? So if you really want to understand a little bit more about these 6 different sensual fields, refer to the previous sharing and you will find some information there. But basically, five aggregates refers to the process by which all this arises in the mind, and we become aware. We become aware of what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch. We become aware of what we're thinking, even thoughts. That is also another sensual field. So that is a mental sensual field. So what we can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, and think. These are the 6 areas. Now, the Buddha warned us that when these arise, when we become aware and we cling on to it, we say, oh, this is mine. I like this. Oh, this is so nice. I like this. I enjoy this. Or if it is something unpleasant, then we start to say, oh, I don't like this. This is hurting me. So this I, me, or mine, that is always arising with every time we experience the environment. If we cling on to that, that is suffering. That means every time we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something that is pleasant, or think of a thought that is pleasant, a memory that was pleasant, and we cling on to say, oh, that is so nice, I want it. When we begin to cling on to these thoughts, that is suffering. Right? So the Buddha here described here the 8 conditions of suffering, number 8 being the summary of it all. That's why it started off with that phrase, in brief, meaning summarizing the whole thing, that these 5 aggregates, this process of perception arising in our mind, subject to clinging, that means we begin to cling on to it. If we were to do that, that is suffering. So the whole idea is that if we see something pleasant, we realize it is pleasant, but don't cling on to it. Don't say, oh, I want it, I want it. The more you want something, the more it becomes dukkha, because you can't keep anything forever. You can't even keep your own body forever. If you think the body is you, the body is not you, because the body is changing. Every minute as we speak, the cells on your skin are dying. Every time you take a shower, millions of skin cells fall off, and then new skin cells arise. And so the skin cells is constantly changing by the minute even, right? If you talk about the rest of the body, the deepest part of the body, the bones, the skeletal structure, medical science has discovered even the skeletal bones are refreshed after about 7 years. Some say 7, some say 9. Around that, all the bones in our body are completely new set, because as we age, the old bone, all the old cells will die off, new cells will arise. So even the skeletal structure in your body changes after 7 or 8 years. So are you who you were? You are not even who you were a moment ago, because something has changed in you. The hair, for instance, in your case, not in my case, the hair, for instance, it turns white, right, as time goes by. So all these we have to be aware that if we cling on to what we experience in the environment and what we experience in our thought, and we cling on to it, it brings us a lot of suffering. This is really what the Buddha meant in this first noble truth, that these conditions of suffering have to be understood. And number 8 is the mother of all suffering, that if we cling on to everything we experience and perceive, it brings us a lot of suffering. All this has to be understood. That's why the Buddha pointed out that the first noble truth has to be understood. And when we can understand these 8 conditions of suffering, then we already have an understanding of what the problem is, right? So then it takes us to the next point, right? How does it arise? Here I mentioned in brief these inevitable realities of modern life. It's happening to us moment to moment, day in and day out. It is not something that happens once in a blue moon. Day in and day out, environmental activities constantly stimulate our sense organs, bombarding our attention system. So if every time we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, we cling on to it, or we feel, we react to it, it brings us suffering, bombarding our senses. For example, when you're driving down the street, driving, and then somebody cuts in front of you. Most of us, we press our honk, and then, or some of us get very upset, right? And if we do that, it is dukkha. So all these things happening around us, that is dukkha. You're trying to sleep at night, and this mosquito starts to come. And then you try to chase it away. Now, if you keep thinking, oh, this mosquito, I'm so angry with it, the more you think about that, the more suffering you will experience. Find a solution to prevent the mosquitoes from coming. Find a solution to wave away the mosquitoes. Sleep under a mosquito net, right? So all these are things happening around us, bombarding our attention system. And things are unpredictable. They're changing. Anicca, constantly changing. And that is also producing a lot of dukkha in us because it is not as we want. Things are always changing. They are unpredictable, they are uncertain, and we feel insecure. That is dukkha. And people around us, our parents, our children, our siblings, our teachers, our students, our bosses, our employees, all these, they impose their demands upon us. They impose their expectations on us. All that is suffering and put pressure on us to respond. And deadlines, we have to meet deadlines constantly, making sure that we can do according to the planned schedule. Otherwise, we're going to get in trouble with our bosses, with our relatives, with our friends, right? If there's a wedding and we turn up late, that is not nice. So all these are putting pressure on us, the inevitable realities of modern life. And we constantly experience all kinds of problems. So all this is hurting us in one way or another, disturbing us, agitating us. Therefore, we begin to perceive them with a perception of threats or conflicts. That means we think of these as something that is threatening our peace of mind, something that is in conflict with our wishes and desires. And when you begin to perceive these environmental conditions as that, you are experiencing all kinds of dukkha. And we have to understand that these three parts of the mind is responding to our environment. I spoke about this in a lot of details in the last sharing. So I won't go very deep, but very briefly, we need to just do a quick recap on it. The Buddha used three words to describe the mind. That's why I call these the three parts of mental experiences. The mind is a mental experience. The mind is not an entity. It's not an object that exists. It is an experience. It is an activity that gives us an experience. And first, the Buddha said, vijnana. That means we're able to perceive objects in the environment. Awareness of what was perceived through our sense organs. The second word the Buddha used is mano, which is the cognitive process. Meaning we're able to cognize, we're able to identify what has been perceived. And identifying perceived objects, and then being able to cognize the experience so that we now create a concept. So there's cognition and conception. And then we have ideas, and then we have choices. Right? Then we're able to decide what to do. That is the thinking part. Then comes the emotional part, chitta, the affective process of mind. Chitta really refers to this process called the affective process that leads to mood and temperament. If it is something pleasant, we are in a good mood. We feel nice about it. And if it is something unpleasant, oh, we are in a foul mood. Right? And then we have this urge to want to respond or react. That is temperament. So mood is how we feel about something. Temperament is what we want to do about it, that emotional urge. And this emotional urge leads to a reaction. And this reaction is called tanha. So tanha really refers to this emotional reaction towards feeling of something, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. So we react to every time we experience something to be pleasant or unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant, we react in one way or another. And I'm going to talk about three kinds of reactions, three kinds of tanha in a moment. So that reaction, and this is really leading to mood and temperament. And we also cling on to that experience, personalizing the experience, clinging on. That leads to the notion of this self-centered existence. I, me, or mine. I don't like this. I hate this. Oh, I enjoy this. Right? So the I, me, or mind becomes very strong. The notion of self-centered existence. So let's take a look at an explanation of this chitta and how it dominates, controls us, and puts us under its spell. Right? This is the emotional mind called chitta. Let Bhante Punnaji explain to you.
So in the human being, the thinking part is called mano, whereas the emotional part is called chitta. But the Buddha pointed out was what has to be done is not to obey the chitta. What is happening today is that the mano part, the thinking part, is doing what the chitta wants. You see, chitta is dominating the mind. And the mano is just catering to the chitta. There is a verse where the Buddha says, Chittena niyati loko, chittena parikassati, chittassa eka dhammassa, sabbeva vasamangvagu. What that means is, chitta is dominating the world. Chittena niyati loko. Loka is the world. Chittena niyati loko. Chittena parikassati. Chitta is disturbing everything. Chittassa ekadammassa. Chitta is that one thing. Sabbeva vasamangvagu. That everyone is spellbound by chitta. Everyone is dominated by chitta. Like being spellbound. So therefore, the only thing is to learn how to gain control over the chitta, the emotional part.
Chitta dominates. Right? So Bhante was saying that there is the thinking mind called mano, and mano is really responding to the emotions, chitta. We are basically creatures of emotions. We use our emotion to make decisions, and we use our thinking to justify our decisions. So chitta is really dominating the mind if we allow it to, and we always constantly, unconsciously allow chitta to dominate. We allow emotions to take control because we don't think about it. Every time things happen, we don't think too clearly. We just react emotionally. And that's why it controls. So mano is just catering to the chitta. So we're actually using our thinking mind to try to satisfy what this emotional mind wants. Right? This emotional mind is always wanting things or wanting to get rid of things. And we are all spellbound by chitta, this emotional mind. The solution, the Bhante said, is to learn how to gain control over the chitta. We will touch a little bit on this today, but in the next sharing next week, I will go more into how we can gain control over chitta by practicing the medial way or the middle way, that the Buddha taught, which actually is a summary of the Eightfold Way. So the solution is to learn how to gain control over the chitta. And this is the verse that Bhante was referring to. Emotions dominate the world. Emotions create distress. Emotion is that one thing to which all are spellbound. Emotions dominate the world, meaning that our emotions are constantly taking control if we allow it to, and we unconsciously always allow it to, unless we are conscious, unless we are thinking. And this conscious thinking is called mindfulness. If we are not mindful, chitta takes control. Our emotions take control, dominate the world. And it creates distress. Distress is this mental suffering. The mind is agitated. The mind is not at peace anymore. The mind is reacting, rebelling, revolting. So that is really a state of distress. Therefore, emotion is that one thing to which all are spellbound. If we're not careful, we are under the control of our emotions. And this is what Bhante was trying to warn us. And this is in fact what the Buddha said in the Chitta Sutra, in the Samyutta Nikaya. And very importantly, one of the greatest benefits I have derived from learning from Bhante Pudanji is the fact that he was able to discern the words that the Buddha used between mano, chitta, vijnana, so that we are able to gain a better understanding of what the Buddha was trying to say. This verse here, this Chitta Sutra verse, is often translated as mind dominates the world, mind creates distress, mind is that one thing to which all are spellbound. Because many translators, in fact, most other translators I've come across, they just translate the word chitta as mind. They don't discern between the emotional mind and the thinking mind. But if you think deeply, you will realize that we have two minds. One mind that is aware, right, attentive, and that is the thinking mind. The other mind that is arising like undercurrent, sending thoughts, creating thoughts out of the blue, directing us, disturbing us, agitating us, making us think in certain ways. That is the emotional mind, the unconscious emotional mind. And chitta is referring to that unconscious emotional mind. Right. So all this leads to what I call the vicious cycle of emotions. I explained this in great detail the last sharing. So if you want a bit more understanding of this, please refer to the previous sharing. So I won't go through the whole thing all over again, but I'll just run through just as a recap. Everything happening around us, they're stimulating our sense organs. And then when we begin to perceive things, we begin to perceive them, right? In this case where it is agitating us, disturbing us, I pointed out to you the inevitable realities of modern life. We begin to perceive it as a threat or a conflict, and that arouses our emotion. So this perception, awareness of our environment is called vijnana, that first part of the mind. And this thinking, this ability to interpret and identify what we perceive, that is our cognitive process, our thinking mind, right? And then it arouses the emotions. So emotions are aroused and hormones are released, stress hormones are released in the body, making the body all tensed, discomfort in the body. So this emotions arising is the chitta. And this discomfort in the body is stress, the fight or flight reaction that naturally arises. We can't prevent this arising easily, but we can do something about it afterwards. In other words, we can't stop this arising. So this arising causes bodily discomfort, and that bodily discomfort is dukkha. And when we experience dukkha, the mind gets disturbed. And that's why in the verse earlier, in the Chitta Sutra verse earlier, it was mentioned that the chitta then creates distress. And therefore, it disturbs the mind, and the disturbance of the mind is called distress. And this distress leads us to behave in habitual emotional manner. So this is called the habitual emotional reactions. So we begin to react. And if it is something pleasant, we react with greed and lust. If it is something unpleasant, we react with anger, fear, or hatred. If it is something uncertain, we react with worry and anxiety. If it affects our ego, we react with jealousy and conceit. If it is something we wish we should never have done, we may react with shame, and so on. Now, if we don't prevent this reaction from getting out of control, we allow it to continue, it actually does something worse to us. It makes us personalize this, and we start to get really upset, really angry, and this pushes us to an extreme state of emotional anger, distress, and so on. And this is beginning to feed these emotions with imagination, memory, expectations. This is called mental proliferation. It can lead people to post-traumatic stress disorder. It can lead people to to depression. And when you go into depression, you may even become suicidal. So this is really very, very dangerous when it gets up to that stage. So this reaction is tanha, our emotional reaction. Tanha is often translated as craving. I will come to this explanation in a moment. But tanha is really our reaction, our emotional reaction. And then we begin to cling on to this experience, right? And that's what Buddha warned us in the first noble truth, number 8, upadana. So we begin to cling on to this, and that makes it worse. So that leads us to deep suffering even. Right? So this is really, in a nutshell, how I describe this as the vicious cycle of emotions. Right? Now, the word dukkha is often misunderstood. They often think that, oh, dukkha means suffering. And when we talk about dukkha as suffering, everybody thinks of it as, oh, it must be some great big suffering. But dukkha is not just about great big suffering. It can be very simple things. Things are uncertain. Things are happening and changing all the time. So we feel insecure because nothing stays the same. Everything is always changing. We're feeling insecure. This feeling of insecurity, uncertainty, anxiety, this is dukkha. And every single one of us is going through this experience deeply in the last 9 months when we are still experiencing this coronavirus pandemic. And that is a lot of dukkha. And at the same time, things are not as we want. People who have a business are not able to grow the business, not able to run the business in the normal way. So we are not satisfied. Dissatisfactoriness is dukkha. There are also other aspects of dukkha. We may injure ourselves, pain, sorrow. We may lose a dearly departed person, grief, lamentation. We may become so uncertain about what's the future lies, and then we start to have anxiety, worries, fear, frustration, unhappiness, and we experience trauma. All these are stress and distress. And then we have anguish, depression, perplexity, confusion, not even knowing what to do. And during the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of us are experiencing boredom and perplexity, not knowing what to do. So all these are various different manifestations of dukkha. So dukkha is not just as simple as suffering in that sense, but you could sum it all up and say all this is leading us to some form of suffering, whether it is mild, like boredom, or it is something severe, like trauma. Right? So all these are different manifestations of dukkha. And that leads us to the second noble truth. Why? Why do we experience dukkha? What is the origin of dukkha? So the origin of dukkha, the Buddha described, he calls it samudaya. And he pointed to tanha. Tanha, as I mentioned, is translated normally as craving. And that leads to renewed existence accompanied by delight and lust seeking delight here and there. So when we experience dukkha, we often want to find something pleasant, something pleasing to take us out of our suffering. So we're always seeking for delight. So when something happens and it hurts us, we react. And dukkha, therefore, is not craving. Craving has been used widely, but craving is not very accurate in explaining the meaning of tanha. The real meaning of tanha is emotional reaction. That when our emotions are aroused, we want to react. We want to do something, right? We want to do something to satisfy our ego. We want to do something to satisfy our lust and greed. We want to do something to fight away what is hurting us. So it is a kind of fight or flight reaction. So it is this reaction, emotional reaction, either wanting something or want to get rid of something, right? And there are really three kinds of dukkha. The first is, three kinds of tanha. The first is tanha for sensual pleasures. And this is really called kama tanha. Here the word kama, K-A-M-A, means sensual, sensuality, something that comes through our senses, that we experience through our senses. So pleasant sensations. So when we experience that, we want it. We want it. And that is kama tanha. Wanting something associated with sensual pleasures is kama tanha. And that leads us to behave in a manner called lobha. Lobha is lust and greed for pleasures. Lust turns into greed because these are different levels. First, when we experience something pleasant, we want it. We want to go after it. Wanting to go after it, that is called lust. But once we get what we want, are we always satisfied? Not many times. When we get what we want more. When you start to want more, that is called greed. I give you the simple example. Your next door neighbor throws a durian party. I don't know, nowadays they are allowed to do that, but let's say they invite a couple of neighbors, come and enjoy some durian. So when you see somebody, let's say I'm assuming you love durian. So you go there and you see somebody open the durian, smells good. You want it. You want to eat it. That is lust. So you take it and you start to enjoy one piece. And you might enjoy a second piece. And it's very good. Now, when you enjoyed one or two pieces, and then you see the owner bringing out this great big basket of Musang King durian and starts to open a few more, will you say to him, okay, I have two pieces, that's enough, I don't want any more, thank you? Will you do that? Most people don't do that. Most people say, oh, how about me? I'm going to have another piece. And that becomes greed. So lust turns into greed. This is when it is something that is pleasing. What if it is something not so pleasing? Then we have this tanha for non-existence. And this is called vibhava tanha. You don't want it to exist anymore. You want to get rid of it. So this is an emotional reaction to unpleasant sensations. When you experience something that is unpleasant, you want it to stop. So it is your reaction for non-existence. And then you begin to behave in a manner called dosa. Dosa is aversion leading towards hatred. You begin with aversion. Aversion comes from the root word avoid. So when you experience something unpleasant, first you want to avoid it. But as time goes by, maybe you can't always avoid it. You're stuck with it. What happens? You start to get angry about it. And as you get angry about something you don't want, and it keeps coming at you, you're stuck with it, you can't get rid of it, what happens? You become very angry and even hateful. So aversion eventually turns into hatred. That is what dosa is all about. That you first want to avoid it, eventually you hate it because you can't get rid of it. But wanting to get rid of it is this second form of tanha called vibhava tanha. You don't want it to exist anymore. Vibhava simply means cessation of existence, stopping it from existing. So you are reacting in such a way you don't want it to exist anymore. Reaction for non-existence. And the third type of tanha is tanha for continued existence. This is when we begin to cling on to an experience. And this really is called bhava tanha. When you cling on to an experience, you begin to create this notion of I, me, or mine. I like it, I don't like it. So there is this notion of I, me, or mine that is reacting to what you are experiencing. And this reaction leads to the notion that I exist. There is an I am the most important being in the world. There is this notion that I exist. So therefore, bhavatanha is this emotional reaction to the notion of existence. And this leads us to the third type of behavior called moha. Moha is really the delusion for self-centered existence. Thinking that I exist, and it is all self-centered. It makes us selfish. It makes us focus on the self. And therefore, it strengthens the notion that the self exists. Therefore, this bhavatanha is the emotional reaction to the notion of self-centered existence. And the behavior pattern is moha. So these are the three poisonous roots: lobha, dosa, and moha. The lust and greed for something that is pleasant, the anger and hatred towards something that is unpleasant, and the delusion of a self-centered existence. That is really what the second noble truth is about. And the Buddha told us that in this second noble truth, it is really tanha that is the cause of all this dukkha, the suffering, because we react emotionally. So craving is okay, it's commonly used, but the real meaning of tanha is really an emotional reaction, and a reaction centered around our emotional desires, whether you want something or you want to get rid of something. And that's why the Buddha warned us, this has to be abandoned. We have to learn to let it go. Let go tanha. We have to learn to give up tanha, abandoned. And this is actually mentioned very clearly in the Four Noble Truths, that tanha is to be abandoned in the second noble truth. And that is because it's the cause of our suffering. When we react emotionally, learn not to react emotionally, and then you will find peace and quiet and calm, and peace and comfort. I will talk more about this in the next sharing, where I explain about how to practice the middle way or the medial way in order to overcome all this. But first, we have to understand what the problem is, understanding dukkha, understanding the Four Noble Truths. So now let's listen to Bhante Punnaji explaining this cognitive psychology, this new form of psychology, where it teaches us to use our thinking, our intellect, to help us find more peace of mind and to change our perception of what's going on, so that we are able to perceive things with peace and harmony and feel more peaceful, comfortable, and happy.
And during the 1960s, a new kind of psychology came into being. And that is what is called cognitive psychology. And these cognitive psychologists, they began to realize that there was a method of gaining control over emotions. That is the important thing. And what was that method? They pointed out that they also saw the same problem. What is that? The mano and the chitta. Now what Sigmund Freud called the id and the ego. These people call the ego the cognitive part, and the emotional part they called the affective. The cognitive and the affective. And they pointed out that the emotions are excited only according to the way the cognitive part or the mano interprets circumstances. You see, I told you some time back, a few days ago, that we are born with five senses. And the five senses are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. But all that goes to the brain, and it is the brain that begins to think. And that is the mano part. And according to the way you think and interpret what is going on there, the emotion is aroused. So the emotion is based on the way you interpret your circumstances. And therefore, if you change the way you interpret your circumstance, the emotion is not aroused.
So here Bhante was referring to this new form of psychology called cognitive psychology, which is centered around the application of thinking, how you can use thinking. See, psychology has evolved over the decades, over the centuries. Right? In ancient times, they talk about psychology basically as how the mind works, but they discovered that they could not understand how the mind works. Then they went on to talk about psychology in terms of behavior. So there was behavioral psychology. Then in more recent years, then they have come up with this new form of psychology that finally focuses on application of our thinking, how to apply our thinking in order to help us understand what is going on in the mind. So cognitive psychology, basically there are methods for gaining control over our emotions. So by applying this cognitive psychology, we are learning some methods how to gain control over our emotions. And emotions are aroused according to the way we interpret our circumstances. And I mentioned earlier to you about all these inevitable realities that are happening around us. So we constantly interpret them with threats and conflicts. And because of that interpretation, it arouses the emotion. If we can change that and we begin to interpret everything that's going on with a sense of peace and harmony, we will be able to overcome all that. We will be able to learn how to tame our emotions. So if we can change the way we interpret our circumstances, emotions will not be aroused. And I'm going to explain more about some techniques we can apply in the next sharing. So do come back in the next week. We will continue explaining about this. Now, I'd like to bring up one very important thing and about thinking. And now, this is a shloka. Shloka is a poetic verse. In ancient India, they used this even long before the Buddha's time. They used this to teach children how to behave properly. So this ancient shloka was pointing out taking food, sleeping, avoiding dangers, sexual activities. These acts are common between animals and humans. So basically, all organisms are engaged in this. All animals are engaged in this. They need to take food in order to stay alive. They need to sleep and rest so that they are able to survive continuous struggling. They need to avoid dangers so they do not fall prey to the predators. And they need to pass on their genes to the next generation. So sexual activities originally evolved to help organisms pass on their genes to the next generation. And these are common between all forms of animals. Humans are actually a kind of animals. Human beings is one of the different types of animals, right? And what this sloka went on to say is that the ability to think is what makes us different. This ability to think is what makes the human different, because without thinking, humans are just like animals. That means if we behave emotionally all the time, if we allow our emotions to take control of all our behavior, if our behavior is centered around how we feel about something, about our emotions about something, we are just like animals reacting to emotions. We need to apply our thinking. And that's what cognitive psychology was referring to. In the next sharing, I will hope to show you a few techniques you can do that with. Apply your thinking so that you can actually find more peaceful and beneficial ways of surviving instead of reacting like an animal. So let's listen to Bhante explain this point, and he calls this the Buddhist psychotherapy. This is the very important thing. This is really what the Buddha was trying to teach us, right? So I cut off an earlier part of the video where Bhante was explaining about just now that shloka. So I've already explained the shloka, so let's take it from there.
So the purpose of the Buddha was to teach people how to overcome this animal part and develop that human part properly. It is only then that you become fully human. To get rid of that animal part and cultivate the human part. That is the meaning of becoming a Buddha. That is the meaning of becoming an arahant. Now you may have heard that to become an arahant is to get rid of three things: lobha, dosa and moha. Lobha is what I call lust. Lobha is lust. Dosa is hate. Hatred. The lust, hate, and moha is the delusion of self. All selfishness comes from this delusion of self. Self is a delusion. So it is to get rid of lust, hate and delusion. That is what the Buddha taught. That is to transcend the animal nature and become fully human. But the problem is that fully human state is not a normal state. The fully human state is not a normal state. It is a supernormal state. That is, you are rising above the normal and you are getting into a supernormal state. This is how the Buddha becomes a supernormal person. And the Arahant, a perfected disciple of the Buddha, is also in a supernormal state. Now in modern, what is called psychotherapy, what they are trying to do is to bring an abnormal person into a normal state. But what the Buddha was trying to do was to bring a normal person into a supernormal state. So this is very important to understand, that Buddha was also a psychotherapist, but his psychotherapy was to bring the normal person to a supernormal state. His psychotherapy is not to bring the abnormal person to the normal state, but to bring the normal person to a supernormal state.
That leads us to the third noble truth. In the third noble truth, the Buddha pointed out that there is an end to suffering. So all this can be brought to an end. Nirodha. Nirodha is a very powerful word. It doesn't just mean ending. It means a complete cessation, complete remainderless cessation, completely wiping it all out. That is what Nirodha really means. So it is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that tanha. That means it is our emotional reaction, which, as I pointed out before, always translated as craving, but it is really about our emotional reaction. So tanha really means to learn how to give up, abandon our emotional reactions. So giving up, relinquishing tanha. That means we have to not react emotionally when something happens. Relinquish, give it up. Don't react emotionally. And learn to be free from emotional reaction. Learn to be free from tanha. So that is the freedom from tanha. And then not dependent on tanha for our happiness. Unfortunately, most of us, we depend on emotional reactions for happiness, indulging in sensual pleasures, trying to get rid of what we don't want, trying to go after what we enjoy. So that is really emotional reactions. Do not depend on your emotional reaction for your happiness. So the third noble truth is really referring to the complete cessation of our emotional reactions by giving it up, relinquishing it, becoming free from it, and no longer reliant on it for our happiness. And that, the Buddha pointed out, is to be realized. To realize this. And to realize this, as Bhante Punnaji explained, is to learn how to give up lobha, which is lust and greed, dosa, which is anger and hatred, and moha, which is the delusion of self-centered existence. We're going to learn to give up these three poisons, or the three poisonous fruits: lobha, dosa, moha. So we have to realize we have to do that. And fortunately, the Buddha came up with the fourth noble truth, explaining how we can go about doing it. The way to the cessation of dukkha, the eightfold way, and the supernormal eightfold way. Now, I'm not going to go into the eightfold way in any detail. We will talk about it in a bit more in the next sharing, right? So these are the eight. Now, the eightfold way is to be cultivated. It is not knowledge. It is not just knowledge. It is not there to tell us what it is. It is there to guide us, to practice. It is to be cultivated, right? So the Buddha Dharma is not something to be learned and understood and then put on the shelf. It is something that we need to realize and then cultivate so that we can bring to the final fruition the ending of all suffering. So I like to put this eightfold way in a circular form because it's a continuous improvement cycle. I will explain that in a moment. Let's just quickly look at what makes up the eightfold way. The first part is made of the first two, samadhi, which I will use Bhante Punnaji's translation, and that is harmonious perspective. Like samadhi, often translated as right view, but actually means proper understanding of what it is all about. It is also right understanding. And then we have sama sankappa, which is harmonious orientation, meaning that once you have understood what it's all about, what these four noble truths are about, you now want to do something about it. So you change your life, you reoriented the way you live by practicing, adhering to the 5 precepts, by practicing morality, sila, by practicing metta, right? Universal benevolence and karuna, compassion, cultivating this sense of happiness, not dependent on our sensual pleasures, but basically this altruistic sense of happiness, mudita. And finally, bringing the mind to a state of stillness and harmony and equanimity, right? So that is upekkha. So these are really wanting to do that, right? That is sama sankappa. And all this is grouped into this yellow box or yellow group referred to as Saddha. Saddha is often translated as faith. It is not faith. It's not blind faith. It is founded on understanding. Because of samadhi, you have understanding. And because you have understood it, now you want to do something about it. There is a devotion behind it. There's an energetic motivation behind it. So this understanding, Saddha, brings you confidence and understanding and devotion of what you have learned and understood. And then you are energized. And that is the virya behind it. You have this willpower and energy to want to do something about it. And that is the first part of the Eightfold Way. And then you begin to practice. And the simple practice to start with is sila, the practice of virtuous morality, which is made of right speech, harmonious action, right action, and harmonious lifestyle, right livelihood. And collectively in that blue box, it's called sila. What does sila do for us? Sila helps us purify the body. That means now you behave and you act in a manner which is pure. So that is really what sila does for us. It purifies our behavior. And then, of course, we have the green part, which is the meditation part, samadhi. Samadhi, unfortunately, has been translated as concentration. More and more Buddhist scholars today no longer accept that translation as concentration because they have understood that samadhi is not really concentration. It's a level of mental equilibrium. It is a level of tranquility of mind, stillness of mind. So still that it is able to see through the realities. And that is what samadhi really means. In the green part is the meditation part. And what does meditation do for us? It helps us purify the mind. So sila helps us purify the body. Samadhi helps us purify the mind. And that is really what this fourfold supernormal realities is all about. The Buddha stated there is dukkha, and dukkha is to be understood. And then there is samudaya, the origin of dukkha, and that has to be abandoned, our tanha. And then there is the nirodha, which is the extinguishment of all this tanha, that has to be realized, bringing an end to dukkha. And finally, there is a way we can practice, and that is to be cultivated, the Eightfold Way, the magga, the way leading to the cessation of dukkha. So in summary, Buddhism is really not looking at some supernatural powers out there. We're not worshiping powers. We're worshiping wisdom. And when we look at the Buddha's teaching, we try to understand what it is and what it can do for us. And this is really an attitude called humanism. That's why, in a way, you could say Buddhism is a humanistic religion, or you can say a humanistic philosophy. The other types of religions are called theistic. Theistic is centered around God, theism. Right? Theist refers to God. In Buddhism, we are not centered around God at all. We have little gods in the heaven, but they are not what we are looking at. Right? We're looking at the teachings of the Buddha. So to practice this is to understand we practice it in a humanistic manner. Humanism means it is a doctrine, attitude, or way of life centered on human interests and human values, especially a philosophy that rejects supernaturalism, all these heavenly things. We don't focus on them. It's not to say they don't exist. We don't focus on these heavenly things and supernatural things and superstitions, and instead stress on individuals' dignity and worth and capacity of self-realization through reason. This last part is very important. Self-realization through reason. When we look at the teachings of the Buddha, we try to understand what it is, and by understanding what it is, then we are able to then realize what it means. That is self-realization through reason. And when we find it brings meaning into our life, it helps us eliminate all the suffering that we are experiencing. Then we should be practicing more and more the Buddha Dharma. that is self-realization through reason. So we have to look at Buddhism from a humanistic perspective. And I'll give you one last quote from my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punanji, where he stated, "The purpose of human intelligence is not to discover the truth, but to solve problems." So when the Buddha came and taught us the Four Noble Truths, he's not talking about this truth we should all be accepting and embracing. The Buddha was teaching us the solution to the problem. And what is the problem? The problem of dukkha. So the Four Noble Truths really teaches us it as a solution to the problem. Number one, to understand what the problem is. Number two, to realize what is the cause of the problem and learn to abandon these causes. And number three, to know that it can all be brought to an end, the cessation of dukkha. And finally, number four, the way leading to the cessation of dukkha. After all this is over, if you still have questions, feel free to drop me an email, connect me through Facebook or whatever. But don't forget to download the document which contains all the presentation slides. And with that, I end my sharing. Thank you very much. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.